and I would allow four, and I would allow like the other members of my panel to introduce themselves as well. Is the panelist in?
Hello, please am I audible? Yes, I'm Henry Kofi. I'm going to be a panelist for today's round. I hope I was audible.
Well, cool. So I'm also going to allow the teams to introduce themselves, starting with opening government.
Mohamed Amin going first, and no gender pronoun preferences.
Mahmut Enes second, he, him. Thank you.
Cool. Opening up.
Prince speaking first, no preference.
Mehdi speaking second, no preference.
Thank you. Closing up.
Abdul Fattaw will be speaking first.
I'm Elisha speaking second. He did. Thank you.
Thank you. And closing up.
Westwam was speaking first for closing up. Selasie speaking second. Westwam with no preferred pronoun. Selasie, she, her.
Cool. Thank you. So, guys, you know the BP rules. They would also be applying in this debate. I won't be able to time you, unfortunately, because yeah, I don't have my other device right now. So what you can also do is I'm going to ask if my panelist is able to time, but if he's unable to time you guys, you can also ask your teammates to be posting the timestamps in the chat space so that you can also take notes. That said, let's remember to respect each other's preferred pronouns and let's just have a good debate. Yeah. So calling upon the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Okay, guys. POIs, you can interrupt me, like you can directly speak. So don't write in the chat. I will not be seeing it. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So dear panel, before starting to explain what today's debate is about, I'm going to tell you what it is not about. Today's debate is not about protection of labor rights. It's not about protection of the rights of workers who are oppressed by these very bad bosses and so on. Today's debate is about saving the whole country, the whole nation from a bankruptcy. It's saving the whole country from an economic crisis that is going to lead to a severe disruption of normal life, that's going to lead the country into, God forbid, to famine, to a situation whereby the country cannot feed its own people. Why it's not about protection of labor rights? The first thing is this is an emergency situation which can last from days to maybe a few months until the situation goes away. It's an emergency situation whereby the government has the mandate to use any way possible, any tools in its hands to enable the continuity of the normality of life and prosperity. So we can compare this scenario to a war time whereby the governments can suspend rights and liberties for the sake of saving the whole nation. So what do we mean by economic crisis? It's an economic crisis whereby the unemployment rate is so high that families will not be able to feed themselves. It's a situation whereby not even one person in a family of 6 and 7 people, especially in developing countries, is not able to get any money so that they can buy daily bread and survive. In this situation, I don't think nobody can talk about liberties and so on. These people will sell their body parts, they will sell their lives to feed their own people. So couple of definitions. What do we mean temporarily? As I said, it lasts from days to months, and it's an unusual situation that's an emergency. So the situation continues as long as the emergency persists. And what do we mean by significantly reducing labor standards? We don't mean employers can kill their workers. We don't mean we empower child labor or slavery. We don't mean all of these bad things. We mean increasing of working hours. We mean reducing of health benefits. We mean reducing of benefits which can be which can be sacrificed for the sake of the state, which will not lead to a significant reduction in the living standard, so that it will kill the people that we think we are going to be saving. And what do we mean by unusual? Unusual unemployment, we don't mean like unemployment that's raising to 20% or 30%, which is very common in developing countries. We mean unemployment whereby it's like 90%, 95% of the people. And in these situations, I don't think anybody will be able to defend those 5% of people working while at the same time putting the lives of the majority of 90% of the people in jeopardy. So how do we
Clarification.
Okay, continue.
Okay, so the thing is that, like, you know, in developing world, or like the people that you are speaking about, they are like suffering either in time of crisis or not. But like, why should we take this over all people around the world for development?
That is very reductionist. That is a very reductionist argument. In a time of normalcy, developing countries are able to feed their people. They are able to, at least for some degree, to provide bread. In this situation, when there is high unemployment, we don't mean unemployment which is given by government figures. We mean unemployment even in the blacks, in underground economy, whereby people are not even able to make money and to go into the market. This is an economic crisis which is unprecedented. If it was a normal time unemployment, we don't even need to debate this motion. So going into the model, what are we going to do? We are going to make sure that human rights are not violated under any circumstances by firms or by anyone. We are going to only increase working hours. We are going to decrease minimum wage. We are going to listen health standard as long as it doesn't lead to death and the decouplement of workers. And this is going to last for a few months. And the government is going to make an executive order, and it will enforce this, and it will make sure that the people will not, the firms will not misuse this situation to exploit the workers. And it will be a life and death situation whereby the government is responsible for everything. And if you are going to question the ability of the government to do this, then we don't even need to debate this motion, because the government will not be able to protect the labor rights in the first place if it's not efficient enough. Three arguments for this debate. The first thing is about saving jobs, lives, and living standards of people, whereby they are going out and making $10 and $15 a day to eat food. And this motion is about saving the jobs of these people, the majority of the people who are significantly women, who are significantly children, who are significantly minorities, who lose their jobs, who lose their livelihood under economic crisis. The second thing is about saving firms and the long run consequence of saving firms. We know that firms are the main providers of job security and livelihood. We don't. We know that governments are not able to give benefits and to give funding in time of this high unemployment. The government doesn't have the ability to do that, and even if it had the ability to do that, we know that how that will create another problem, which is balance of payment problem, budget deficit, and so on and so forth. And next to the saving of jobs and saving firms, it's about protecting the country from foreign dependence of aid. We don't want the government to take aid or debt in under any circumstance from foreign powers, because this is going to create dependency and cycle of dependency on foreign aid and debt, which we know that it creates a cycle where you cannot go out from it, and it's very, very detrimental. So who gives the government the legitimacy to do this? Who gives the government the mandate to do this? It's the nation, it's the constitution, it is every law that is credible in the state which gives the government the right to save the nation in time of war, in time of peace, in time of a very significant economic crisis, an unusual time, which is a very critical point in this debate, unusual time, which makes the government to have the legitimacy to take any measures to enforce these laws. Okay, on our side of the house, what we are going to do is we are going to make the firms exist in the economy, at least, even the ones who are here, so that we will not lead to further unemployment. Even more unemployment. The second thing is, by reducing labor rights, we are going to make sure that more firms will come back to the market and create more jobs, and people will be having something to eat. They will be going out and working. At least their benefits will be reduced for maybe 1 month and 2 months, and then they come back it again. But in the other side of the house, what is going to happen is the government will be trying to force rules on the firms, and the firms will exit the market, and the whole things will collapse, or even they will not comply with the government, and there'll be an underground economy which is going to reduce the state's power.
Yeah,
Because of this reason, vote OG. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. Now calling upon the leader of opposition to start off case. Here.
Okay, like unmute yourself for QI. I will be reading using my screen. So like I won't be reading the chat. Unmute yourself like around, I don't know, like 4 minutes or 5, something around that. Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So in my speech, I'm going to talk about like how this is going to look like, and like how the comparative is different from where we have the status quo, show how we still have mechanisms through which we can help the companies, at the same time protecting workers' rights, and then do a comparative analysis in terms of harm, like which harm occurs to the company versus the harm which occurs to these people, and then how this is bad in the long run, right? I think we have to agree that in terms of crisis and bad crisis to the economy, obviously they're going to be some harm, right? So it's either do we want the harm to occur on people who have no system of protection, or like to some companies which have at least some financial backup plans on these kind of things. I want to engage with the government before proceeding, because they cannot have their cake and eat it too, right? They're saying how this is going to be good to workers because they're still going to be working, right? But notice how there is a tension in their argument. If their argument is that there can be relaxation on workers' hours, then I as a company have no incentive to hire more people, because I can literally hire few people. I can literally hire one person and make them do the work of 2 people literally. Now the companies have an incentive to hire more people because yes, there is a maximum number of people. There is a maximum number of hours that one person can work, and you have to make people do something which is appropriate, right? So if you can literally put a relaxation on working hours, it means you have no incentive to hire more people, because you can get few people to do the work which was done by most other people, right? But also in terms of like minimum wages, here we're not talking about 15 USD. Literally, companies have an incentive to pay as low as they can, as low as it gets, because they're not mandated by the law to actually give some wage which is necessary for some sort of survival. And this is why I want to frame how this is going to look like. It's going to be different from the status quo. I think in the status quo, we have these labor conditions and regulations which make companies liable for violating workers' rights, which make sure you have to give some sort of required wages. Like all these things are mandated by law. All these things that we're talking about, they are mandated by the law. You're mandated by law to do it, and then you have you face some sort of punishment, lawsuits, and so on if you don't do this, right? I think this exists as a necessary condition because it is a constraint to companies' self-interest. Literally, we know that companies, their incentive is to maximize profit as much as they can. Literally don't care about anything else, which is why this law exists in the first place, to act as a hindrance to that kind of self-interest which seeks to only maximize their profit margins without any bother, right? I think this is important. So what's the comparative that happens on the government side? When there is a relaxation on this kind of regulations, now companies are not liable to do all these things, right? Because that's what that relaxation means, right? It means, for example, we are not going to be enforcing these labor conditions on companies so they can get away with doing these things, right? They cannot be held accountable for all of these things happening. Why is this bad? It's because you know that companies are so good at literally exploiting the loopholes, are so good at exploiting anything which can increase their profit margins, right? So this means that they are going to go out of their way to actually do even the very, very bad things, because now there is a relaxation which says companies can make you work some extra hours, pay you a little bit less, and then they're actually going to exploit that and do really bad things as maximizing their interest. Yeah, your POI, I mean.
Okay. This is a very unusual and a very short time of period. How are your harms going to create all these problems you say when it is only for maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks? You can go back to normalcy.
Yeah, so let me say how we solve the problem better than you guys. I think the first thing we have to understand is like which sort of companies exist in the economy. Because even if we are in a really bad time, I don't think Amazon needs saving. I don't think Microsoft needs saving. I don't think Facebook has a problem. These are like really companies which have like obscene amounts of financial backup plans. Like I don't think Big Pharma needs saving, right? I think in the status quo, we already have a tier system which is able to actually screen companies who can navigate even the worst kind of like crisis, given that even like when you're talking about like COVID-19, which has been one of the worst crises in the last 100 years, actually some companies have fared better in COVID. So I don't think we have to put all the companies in one basket, right? On our side of the house, we are able to actually put companies in categories, and based on their balance sheet, based on their financial incomes and output and productivity, we're able to say these companies are able to navigate the pandemic, are able to navigate the crisis on their own. These other companies cannot do so. Why is this our case better? On our side of the house, we are able to provide like a kind of like tiered response, where as the government, we are able to actually assist this kind of like everyday companies which cannot survive with the government input, right? So we can actually provide sort of bailout systems to some companies which are really good in terms of providing employment, but that given their balance sheet are not able to actually survive this crisis period they're talking about. But for these huge companies, we have no imperative to actually kind of relax the labor conditions, because they can already do good without us. Why is it better? Because there are two things. Because there are two things, right? Notice that if you literally relax the wage, and if you relax health conditions and all these other things, it means that these people already, they have no financial backup plans. Like most people literally, unlike companies which have balance sheet, which can survive like periods of crisis, like 1 year crisis or two, these people literally live check on check. Like if they don't get paid for 2 months, they are literally off. Right? So this means that they are going to put a burden on the social welfare system, right? So it's not like, oh, these people have no jobs anymore. Like these people are not getting paid enough anymore. And it's something which does not have impacts on the other economic layers, right? These people are going to be demanding like welfare system from the government, welfare system from other means. These people start like literally like being a burden to the social system, because now they engage in things like robbery, all the weird things that we can talk about, right? Because they're so desperate to find other means of survival. This means that we are overburdening the social welfare system, which is already weak as it exists now. This means that we are overburdening even like the social framework, like all these kind of things, right? Which has all the negative implications. I think it's better on our side, because anyway, we have to understand that not any crisis looks like another crisis, right? So even if crisis might result in people losing unemployment, then we have to actually think about how does the crisis look like? So imagine relaxing health standards in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, like literally people are going to work without like, kind of like distance and stuff, which is putting their health in danger, right? So I think this is why response is better, because rather than providing a general response, we are actually analyzing the companies and how the crisis looks like. And then we are providing a specific response, which is we are helping the companies as the government which need help, because that's better than overburdening our social welfare system. And these big companies which have enough balance sheet to actually survive the pandemic, they can still go on working. Obviously, their profit margins are going to get reduced. They will not be negative. They will still be positive somehow, but less. But then our peoples are going to be protected, getting the salary that deserves the work that they put. Like, yeah, cool. I think my time is over. Rest my case.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister to also begin their case. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I will be starting 1 minute, 1 second, please. POIs, I will be saying in the 5th minute for if you have a POI, I will be taking them. So 1, 2, 3. Yes. Firstly, thank you for the opposition. I will be trying to firstly propose some arguments for understanding the matter better. Then I will be trying to give some response to the what opposition said, what they wanted to clarify. So firstly, what is the unemployment mean? So why we are thinking that it is really significant and we need to take step as government. So unemployment is basically mean what leads unemployment is it is directly an economic crisis. So it means we have a big economic crisis on the ground, and what it mean economic crisis will let every issues, it will let every problems in the country, in the areas for the women, for the children, for the elders, for the men, etc. It will basically affect everything. So we want to make sure that, as government mentioned, the economic crisis on the ground. So economic crisis is also mean, so I will be answering the health issue. So why we are affecting also the health problem, why we are touching upon the health standards, for example, right? So what we have to do about the health standards? Because we had to do that because economic problems means also health problems. Health in the health area, in the health ministry, it means we have some big problems. It means we are not able to sustain the beds. We are not able to sustain the technological devices. We are not able to sustain doctors. We are not able to sustain areas, etc., health areas. So what it means, we are just need to use the hospitals, the health areas for some necessary stuff, some necessary people, some necessary, for example, for elders, for children, for babies. We need to look at them first, then we need to come to the workers who are men, who are powerful, who are strong enough. Then, so we are not also demolishing it. We are not also not just getting rid of it, but we are temporarily just affecting and touching upon it because we are in economic crisis. Secondly, so it was mentioned, right, employers and employees. So we need employers not for just making them rich. So also they are also rich. They are already rich, right? So why we need to serve the strong companies? Why we need to look at the windows, right? As opposition said, but we need to make sure that they are able to sustain themselves in a normal level or in a very little bit lessened level, because we need them in economic crisis. We need their powers and in economic crisis. So it is not about making them rich, or they will be just making their workers more work more and more. So economic crisis will affect every companies, not just the small companies, but also big companies, right? We need both of them. Small companies can be just demolished and can just can be get it rid of or etc. But big companies also, we need their powers because they are funding us, they are helping the government. Be sure, for example, how we know the USA, we know them with their Apple company, we know them with their Windows, etc. So it is also significant for their prestige, etc. So it is significant that we need their powers. Economic crisis also led a war, for example, thing. So we in a war we need economic powers from these companies. Just imagine this. So we cannot make them lessened in their powers because we need their powers. Second, the third, sorry, I will be just touching upon right now what is the meaning of working. So we are making these people, these employees work more, right? So why we need their works more? Why we need to make their conditions bad considerably, right? But we are making this temporarily for we want to make sure about this. So because when you have an issue, you need to work hard to solve it. So there is an issue, big issue, which affects country, everyone in the countries, companies, people, children, etc. So if you have an issue in your individual life, for example, if you have a problem with math, what you need to do, you need to work hard, basically. So if you have a problem in an issue, if a company have an issue about this, they need to work hard. They need to work hard, not just for employees, also employers need to work hard, for example. So we want to make sure the nature of the work, why we are making these people work hard, work more. We are making this because working brings success. Work brings success. So we had to make this because it is the nature of the economic crisis. If there's an economic crisis, if there's an issue, we need to people work and make their stuffs more. Also, it is a country issue, and you need to, everyone in the country need to take steps more and more. So I will take a question from opening opposition. Do you have closing opposition? Do you have? Okay, I will be continuing. Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to make sure about the nature. Nature leads us to act in that way. If you don't do that, if you don't took these steps, it means you are taking steps against the nature of the economic crisis. You need to take steps in this thing. Yes, cool. The thing is, for example, Windows and Facebook was mentioned, right? So we are not just caring the employers, but we are making sure that we are caring the employees as well. We want to make sure the employees' well-being. For example, imagine employees' children has a health issue. So if in economic crisis, if they don't take steps, if we don't take steps in that way, what will it lead? It will basically lead the bad conditions for these children. So we need to take those steps, and we want to make sure that the well-being of country is here, the prestige of it here, and it can raise in the area of whole countries in a good way, in a true way, and we can just try to supply it. Thank you, and vote for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. Now calling upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue our case. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Perfect.
All right, I will take my POIs vocally around like 5:30, so I'll get them ready, most probably from CG. Having that said, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's take a look at the government's word. So the government comes and tell you in their first speaker that, like, the most important thing to tackle a crisis is to make the companies survive and to not allow them to, get off or like have a financial crisis and stuff like that, ignoring completely the rights of the workers and the rights of the things. And they put the highest burden on this. So basically, I have 2 things to say on that. The first thing is that, like, this motion, when it's related to relaxation of minimum labor standards, the stakeholders are mainly 2. One is the company, that's true, and we're showing you why, like, this is like not really much like harming the company, and like that's our first argument, how companies do not suffer as much as the workers. The second thing is that, like, the workers are a major a stakeholder in this company, or like, in this motion overall, because of their nature of the work, because they are the ones that are getting like more inflicted with harm in the crisis. And we will show that through our second arguments, how workers suffer more than companies. And the third thing is that, like, we're going to give you the comparative of the word of the government, and then a comparative with the alternatives that Chris has mentioned, you developing more on those arguments. So first thing, I just want to say a few things as well. So, like, let's take, like, crises, they come and go, they can last few months, or like, but like a few years or few months and some stuff like that. But like, for example, the human rights or the labor rights or the workers' right that we, like humans, or like, our grandparents or like previous generations have been fighting for 400 years to get like into the level that we got today. So the first thing is that, like, principally we think that it is wrong that, like, there is a significant relaxation in the minimum labor standards, because we think that, like, by losing these, you're losing 100 years of, like, fighting, and like 100 years of struggle for the workers in terms of, like, how they were exploited 100 years ago and how they having more rights now and stuff like that. So the thing is that, like, why we think this premise is true? We think that this premise is true because, like, most of the companies have like capitalistic incentive and gain accumulation incentive, which leads it to, like, when the labor standards are relaxed, basically the companies will be exploiting more. There is no, like, nor the government never brings you some, like, rules or like some setups or like some limits or flags on how this, like, relaxation will happen. Therefore, we are taking it, like, the only thing that they are saying is that, like, you need that the companies survive. So the companies, not only for their survival, there is no accountability when you are relaxing the standards, because basically you are making every kind of exploitation, every kind of, like, reducing the minimum wage and stuff like that, something that is, like, inherently in the hand of the companies, which we think that will, like, widen the gap between these and the workers. So the second thing is that, like, why we think that the companies do not suffer in any case. So even in the companies, like, for example, you have different companies active in different fields and stuff like that. So even if the crisis hits a field, and in the nature of crisis, it does hit one specific field. For example, we have the crisis of 2008. It hit, like, the bitumen sector, and then it affected other sectors, but it didn't affect that much that the companies will not be able to sustain. And Chris already mentioned how some companies companies even gain more money from the crisis, like saying that, like, you know, for example, in the corona crisis, like some companies, for example, social media companies or like medical companies, they eventually made more profit. But here, the comparative is like you have workers as well that are suffering from the companies, that people lose their job during this crisis, that people like also get sick, or like, you know, get like affected by the inflation of prices, etc. So these people now are like, even the minimum wage salary will not be enough for them to survive this crisis, and they will be hurt. But also, like, there is a huge like important comparative that is being given by, like, you know, our first speaker, which is like that the minimum wage worker, basically like that minimum wage only made them survive for 1 month. Meanwhile, like the companies have other alternatives to survive just by taking, you know, like, you know, like there are some government programs that support them. There is international entrepreneurship programs that support them. Therefore, they have some other ways to do that. But like for a simple worker that like didn't even, for example, graduate university, that are working with the minimum wage salary, they don't have any other alternative to do that. Like the comparative here panel is that, like, for example, in the world of like government, like the companies will just go back in the past for 100 years in terms of like exploitation of workers and stuff like that. But also like these workers will be living in more suffering, in more things that can even backlash on the governments and stuff like that later on, with like, you know, angry movements, angry protests, etc. by the workers, because these are the mass, the voice of the mass, and this is like the main stakeholder that is like, you know, creating a critical mass and doing the leverage in the social welfare and the social thing. I'll take you now.
Yeah, so the debate is situated in developing countries because it is developing countries who have high unemployment. And these countries, they don't even have labor laws in the first place. So how do you protect non-existent?
I'm sorry, the debate is not set in the developing countries alone.
High unemployment.
Okay, I got you. Okay, 15 seconds, we're done. So the thing is that like this debate is not only set in developing world, but even if it's set in developing world, when you are making a mistake in your characterization by mentioning that people are getting like, you know, they're not even, that people are like getting so weak salaries and stuff like that, which we think that you are speaking about the black market and about illegal jobs that are not pretty much, okay, wait. That are not pretty much like, you know, accountable by the government and stuff like that, which doesn't make part of this debate at all, because like this is like illegal jobs and these people are already like, you know, it's another debate. It's not, but we're speaking, when you're speaking about relaxation of minimum labor standards, you're speaking about things that are legal and are corresponded by the government. CJ, I will take you now.
Right, so all the alternatives that you outline would not increase the productive capacity of these particular countries. I mean, governments don't create things, it's these particular companies that do. How does your side increase the productive capacity?
Okay, so the thing is that, like, let's be frank about it and let's be clear and net about it. Like, productivity is not something that you should, that should be your priority in terms of crisis. In terms of crisis, you just need to get out of those, the crisis, then you look up on development, then you look out on like like productivity and stuff like that. But on productivity, we think that like you will still be handling the same productivity as you had without a crisis. In terms of crisis, in the moment that you are like, you know, significant, like, you know, respecting the labor standards and stuff like that. And that for two reasons, and this is taking me to my second argument, and like what that, like, you know, I'm speaking about like how basically the workers are like, you know, the main stakeholder in this, because like, for example, when you are reducing the minimum labor standards, you are also decreasing the quality and the productivity of your workers, because you are making them suffer more, and therefore even their productivity inside the company and stuff like that will lessen, because now you are tiring them, you are like putting psychological pressure on them, and they will not be as productive as they were before. So the work that they are doing in 4 hours, basically they will be doing it in 8 hours, just out of psychological pressure, etc. So what we give you, panel, in this debate, and why we win this debate. So we tell you how companies do not suffer marginally, like the same way as the workers, but we also tell you that there are other alternatives that like the companies can use to survive, but these alternatives do not exist on the side of the workers.
You're out of time.
Okay, I raise my case.
Thank you very much for your speech, and what marks the end of opening part. Now, calling upon member of government to begin closing cases. Yeah.
All right, hi. Can I be heard? Am I audible?
Perfect.
Okay, so let me set up my papers. I'll begin soon. All right, so I'll be starting in. So yeah, I'll take my point in the text space. Yeah, or that if you think I can't see it, I've not responded to you, you can just slightly allow me, like remind me, just Don't shout, All right. So I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think it's really important to understand that in periods of high unemployment, most governments must prioritize how to move out of this particular period of unemployment. And it is also important to note that economically speaking, you cannot move out of a period of high unemployment unless, of course, you increase your productive capacity. That's to say, you increase your ability to be able to export things, to be able to produce things, so the living standards of people are higher, so that they can be able to purchase things, so that employers will be much more incentivized to employ them, therefore reducing this period of high employment in the first place. This piece of introduction deals with a lot of the things we had from opening opposition. A couple of things in this speech. First, I'll be talking about the nature of these particular periods, the nature of the kind of companies we are talking about, the principal justification, and then much more on efficiency and why we beat opening opposition. But before all of that, a few responses to opening opposition. LO says that there's no incentive for these particular companies to hire much more people because they can reduce the working hours and give like work that's supposed to be done by 2 people to 1 person. First off, I don't think this is necessarily true because number one, most of these companies want to increase their productive capacity in this particular period. They want to be much more efficient. And I think it makes much more sense for 2 people to be able to work on a particular thing because it increases specialization. It's a division of labor. I don't think in most cases, most of these particular companies are more likely to only hire a limited number of people. They are more likely to hire much more people if we allow this particular policy to exist, because in reducing this particular labor standards, you are reducing their cost of production. Therefore, that whole assumption about them not being incentivized to hire much more people does not really exist. Secondly, they talk about exploitation and the possibility of no accountability on our side. 2 responses to that. First, we don't think that in our world, we cannot be able to check these particular labor standards in the first place. We are saying we're going to be reducing them significantly. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be scraping them away entirely. So we can take, for example, if the minimum wage was at first 15, we're going to bring that at 10 and make sure it stays at 10. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be scraping the minimum wage altogether. Secondly, I think it is still better on our side because the alternative for these individuals that open opposition is concerned about is unemployment. It means that they're going to be suffering through most of these particular periods. I think on our side, at least if they're employed, it's a huge benefit that is only unique to our side. Lastly, DLO says that by doing this particular policy, we'll be reducing progress through labor laws. Again, this is something that is temporary. I don't think a lot of the harms that they talk about is going to actually happen. First off, the nature of these particular companies. This is really important for 2 reasons. Number one, because the kind of companies we are talking about are most likely going to be local companies that hire local individuals. Let's say most of the companies we are talking about are companies that are more likely to be affected by these high periods of unemployment. But secondly, even if you are talking about companies that are huge, these companies are still affected by high periods of unemployment for 2 reasons. Number one, because they will have low amounts of revenue due to the fact that if you have high periods of unemployment, it means that there's not a lot of purchasing power. Therefore, most of these companies' shares are going to be going down, and most of the revenues they are going to be gaining from selling their product are also going to go down. But more importantly, notice that in periods of high unemployment, there's also this political idea that's to say you want to bail out these particular companies. The very fact that we always think about bailing these particular, even big companies, means that in periods of high unemployment, they are equally hit by these particular situations. Next, on the nature of these particular periods. First off, it is really important to note that in most of these particular high periods of unemployment, most of these companies are making huge losses and they can't afford these particular standards. That's to say, it's based, and this is where our principal justification comes in. The only reason why these labor standards exist in the first place is because of the assumption that if a company is doing well through during periods that don't contain unemployment or high unemployment, it is justified for them to pay more in terms of like minimum wage and reduce the working hours and give their employees health benefits, etc., etc. Therefore, it's also justified that in periods where they cannot sustain this particular standard, it is justified to reduce these particular standards. Note, we're not saying we're going to be taking them out of the system altogether. This is really, really important because a lot of the arguments we had from open opposition assume that this particular company can still work out. I've already proven to you why they can't really do that. First arguments beyond the principal justification. Why we need to caution the operations of these particular companies. How would this work? First, because of this particular policy, what will most likely happen is that they're going to be reducing the cost of operations for these particular companies. Number one, because they're going to be paying less to these particular employees, and more importantly, they'll be able to sell much more because more people will be employing, given the reduction in labor standards. Why is this particularly important? for two reasons. First, because the alternative is much more worse. That's to say, a world in which these companies are allowed to shut down because of their increasing cost of production, right? And the reason being that in a world where they are shut down, given that most of these companies are more likely to be hiring local individuals, they're going to be increasing the hardships of individuals and the employees that open position is so concerned about. The reason being that in periods of high unemployment, it is most likely that you're going to go to facing periods of high inflation, meaning that the purchasing power of the average individual is going to be reduced. Our world is one that limits the hardships of these particular individuals, because even if they are not earning the minimum wage that they used to earn, at least they are being employed, and this is something that is unique on our side. Secondly, we said that it is difficult for these particular companies to re-enter the industry if we allow open opposition to win. That is to see a world in which these particular companies are allowed to shut down. The reason being that some of these companies might include like manufacturing companies that always need people to purchase this particular product. So it's more, this particular motion is not likely to affect things like tech companies, because these tech companies can produce goods that go beyond these particular countries. So it's more likely that it's going to affect these manufacturing companies, and manufacturing companies have a huge cost of production. So in a world where you don't reduce this standard of like labor, what this means is that you are going to be making it difficult for these people to re-enter these particular industries. Two impacts for this piece of argument. Number one, it means that in the world of the opposition bench, you're going to be increasing these periods of like suffering, and most likely going to be leading to depressions, because you're not going to be increasing your productive capacity. In our world, more people will be hired because there's less standards for labor, etc. Second impact here is that you bring the country backwards, right? That's to say, most countries have a specific kind of thing that they can produce at certain periods of time. So, for example, their GDP is at a specific level. In a situation where you allow most of these companies that matter to these particular countries to go out of business, given that it will be very difficult for them to re-enter the industry, it means that the productive capacity of the country as a whole is going to be reduced. Secondly, second argumentation, why our world is more likely to reduce social vices. Given that in situations of high unemployment, you have purchasing power being like divided amongst people who can actually purchase. That is to say, people who are employed and people who have been laid off. We think that our world is more likely to reduce these social vices because it's periods of unemployment where people are more likely to want to protest against this particular government, because they see that other people are working.
You're out of time.
Yeah, for all of these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now calling upon the member of opposition to begin closing up the case.
Hi, am I audible?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Kindly give me a second. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, simple things or things you'll be getting from CO in today's debate. First of all, I'll be dealing with some responses to CG and OG as a whole, or the governance bench as a whole. Then be giving you extensions on why we believe CO should necessarily win today's debate. Panel, first of all, we tell you that employment solutions require long-lasting employment problems, require more long-lasting solutions. We tell you that every year or at every point in time, there's an inflow of more an inflow of more people who are liable to work, or an increase in the working population. We believe that any kind of solution that takes away the ability or anything that takes away attention to solve these problems should then not be bought into any kind of policy whatsoever. Panel, we're against any kind of temporary solution that one does not provide like the kind of output that Gov Bench would argue. We'll show you how we should not get what they want, or we even get a worse situation on the whole. We tell you that in issues of higher unemployment, panel notes, the company itself is the least affected. Why do we say so? So CG can tell us that the nature of the companies are like the more local ones, which would then be affected by people who have lower revenue. We tell you why this is even on a less likely scale. Why? Because note, panel, these local companies in and of themselves face competition from international multinational companies that have foreign investors, companies that have external influences and other things. Panel, these companies do not only like are affected by the local like surroundings or in itself. These companies also face that kind of like situation. We tell you on any level where you provide an opportunity for these competition that they have to then have a higher chance of success, and in effect shutting down these local companies that side Fiji wants to save. We do not buy into it. Panel, how does this happen? We tell you that in areas or in situations of high unemployment, the people of like the country or the citizens are the most like affected or are the most disadvantaged. We tell you that we are against any kind of policy that puts them in a worse situation. So these people, the government has failed to already provide jobs for them, and the entire country is now in a situation of high unemployment, and they are now secondly being like further oppressed by having to like not oppressed per se, but being further like disadvantaged, yes, to like having to go through these problems. We tell you that it is principally and morally wrong for the government to further disadvantage such people. Panel, note what like how does this look on the whole in comparison with these people, the local companies and the foreign companies? So Panel, we have a situation where these local companies on a normal basis or on a normal day have to fight the foreign competition, which usually have like easy like have the ability to like expand easy because of the kind of external resources that they have access to. They are usually more like built with respect to technology and other things, so it's easier to produce and other things. Panel, knows that these local companies have to then compete against others. Most of these local companies do not have this advantage. What happens in the situation where you are then temporarily significantly reducing the minimum labor standards? One, these companies, the minimum labor standards include things like ensuring that at least a certain percentage of the locals are required. These international companies do not have to abide by that. They then get to take advantage of the people they've already hired, reduce their like wages, and still expand. What happens on the side of the local ones who then have to hire like a fewer people? Note how these local companies usually are the ones that even provide like a less number of like employment and have like comparatively lower wages to these people. The purchasing power that CG talks about could be possible and could possibly exist, but will most likely not exist because these international companies are still going to take advantage of the situation and then cheapen their goods, cheapen the services, and make things more difficult for these local ones to provide the kind of solvency that CG talks about. Panel, we do not think that that is the best way to solve this. Panel, secondly, we tell you that the standard of living of these people will not change with such a policy. Why? Can we note how these minimum like standards are things that will allow the average citizen to live on a normal day, or to be able to survive on a normal day? We tell you that in situations where they are not being catered for like risk allowance, insurance policies, and other things, the minimum or like reduced wage from the side of government that these people are already earning would now have to go into things like this. And meanwhile, the existing policy like possibility of these people of like a higher people getting hired in the first place does not like is not assured. So most of their money is like going to like they having reduced wages and having to like then move their money to across all other places where there's no assurance for others to even be hired, and these solutions probably be even existing. Yes, CG.
You're talking about the improvement of lives of individuals in a situation where the alternative is absolutely no life at all if they don't have jobs. How do you then argue that we are looking at the improvement of life when we are just looking at the sustainability of life as it is before the crisis?
So we tell you that your world provides a solution that is most likely not even going to solve the problem. We would give you better solutions or better ways to sustain the life for as long as possible as we can. So Pan, we tell you how this exploitative nature would not allow CG's world to exist. The capitalistic tendencies of most especially these like international companies would not allow their local companies to have the function or have the abilities that they talk about. Pano, what do we suggest possibly for existing? We suggest like encouraging things like philanthropy, which we already know could possibly exist. In times of COVID-19, for example, people were being encouraged to donate more and provide like relief funds and other things for the people. So we have proved that proof that exists. We are sure that like we have possible solutions of like people like the country in itself ensuring that these people have the kind of minimum wage and ensure that more people are like hired, especially in these multinational companies. Reducing the minimum labor standard does not solve this and does not provide the kind of solvency that they talk about. Panel, in a world where like we have at least we have a solution where at least the people are sustained for some time, while the government is forced to then like create better solutions, like creating better employment solutions for these people. While on their world, out, they still do not get the solvency that they want. We tell you that these local companies will not be able to like be as effective as they claim they would be. They would be disadvantaged because these multinational companies, which are not tied to the social like responsibilities because of the minimum standard labors being reduced and other things, do not care about the people and would then take advantage of the situation to only expand and be better, and then in effect collapse these local companies because these local companies do not have the ability to compete on the same level. We tell you that from that kind of like narrative, all the kind of solutions they propose will not like exist, or the kind of impact they propose will not exist because these people in themselves will not be able to like live or will not be able to survive, and the companies that will most surely bail them out would be collapsed because of the kind of counter like effects that would exist from the other side. For this, proudly closing opposition.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. Now calling upon the government whip to close the case for government case. Here.
Okay, can I be heard?
Perfect.
Awesome. Give me a second to set my timer. Okay. Economic crises are just like emergency situations that give states the emergency power to suspend life as it is. We tell you that in this debate, we believe that companies should be given that power. They should be empowered to suspend the machinery of the economy as it normally is, to ensure that the economy is able to sustain itself for a longer period and we are able to preserve the economy, right? So two things in this debate. First off, I'm going to be giving responses, and secondly, I'll be doing comparative analysis on what this debate has been so far. So first off, on responses, we start with OO's premise for how they started this particular debate. First off, they tell you that, if you allow companies to do this, they will not employ more people, they would abuse the existing employees and not want to employ other people. Fattaw has already dealt with this extensively, but I'm going to add another form of response to this. Notice how in most cases, if you are talking about companies that can't employ people at all, these are companies that have been crippled by whatever economic situation we have in the world that we find ourselves in. So what is more likely to happen is that these companies at this point are focused on retaining the jobs that already exist. So notice that at this point, what is most important is ensuring that people that have jobs are able to sustain their jobs, and people that do not, like people that have their jobs, do not lose them and cause more unemployment than we already have. So notice that in this debate, in bad situations or worst case scenarios where we cannot even employ more people, what is unique to our world is a world where we are able to sustain the jobs that already exist because these standards have been lowered. Notice how that is very, very important in this particular debate, right? And like OO goes out based on that premise. But then their counterprop in this debate, they say that, we are going to look at these companies and then put them into tiers. So we are going to have bigger companies and smaller companies. So with smaller companies, you're going to build them out. First of all, the bailouts are not going to work and it's not going to happen. We get no mechanization on how they're going to make these bailouts work, but a couple of responses to that. First off, these states that we are talking about usually with unusually high unemployment rates, usually have bad economies. How are they going to ensure that they are able to fund bailouts of so many companies that are crumbling down because of the economic situation? Notice how these weaker economies need to even work on providing very, very basic amenities, which they are already struggling to provide in the first place because of the kind of depression that exists in the economy, or the kind of like health crisis or like emergency crisis that exists in that particular country. Therefore, these countries are less likely to have enough money to do bailouts. Also notice how these kind of bailouts are usually like heavily politicized and are unlikely to happen because of the political divides that exist, especially during times of economic crisis. But then more importantly, they talk about how bigger companies are not going to fire anybody and they're just going to like keep everybody anyway. And then the LO mentions profit margins and then like quickly brushes off the idea of profit margins and runs away from it, right? Why are profit margins still important? These companies are still going to keep their profit margins. You can't dictate to them what to do and how to operate as companies, especially when you are not like trying to change the labor laws. What you are saying is that you're going to keep the labor laws exactly how they are, and companies are supposed to follow them and companies are supposed to abide by them, right? What then happens is that companies also have the right to fire as many people as they want if they want to keep their profit margins. What is the incentive for keeping the profit margins? In a time of economic crisis and in a time of depression, companies have the need to be able to show their investors that they are capable of staying afloat and they are capable of keeping those profit margins that existed before. What then happens is that these companies, regardless of the hardships that surround them and hardships that exist in the environments they find themselves in, they are more likely to still go ahead and fire these people. Example being the COVID-19 situation, where Disney furloughed a couple of people, and WWE, that was doing the best numbers it has ever done as a company, was still firing people because it had to keep profit margins, or even in certain situations, increase those profit margins. Those arguments that we get from OO are watching this debate because companies are going to do what they do best, and that is to maximize profit. So how do you ensure that the maximization of profits by companies and the keep it like the ability for people to be able to keep their jobs and to ensure that people are able to afford the very basic things around them exist in the same world? And that's what this debate is about. But then also another important thing, like in this particular debate, right, is the arguments of rights. We tell you that most important thing in this debate is people keeping their jobs, and we think that certain things can be limited for these people to be able to keep their jobs. But notice how OO and CO argues as if these workers have absolutely no agency and they do not have like any ability to complain in situations where they are being treated poorly. We tell you that in situations where these particular like new regulations are killing people or are choking the life out of people, there's a potential for government to step in and ensure that it doesn't get to a point where people are dying because their jobs are killing them, or people are being abused to the extent that the quality of life goes down considerably. So the entire argument from OO is one that does not really like take account the possibility, I'll take you later, the possibility of these workers to have an agency to complain and to speak up in situations where they're not being treated well, right? But then panel, what does CEO say? CEO starts their entire argument, oh, we need something that is very long-term. They start with a very poor characterization of the situation where people do not have jobs, right? And then they suggest an alternative that, oh, we are going to use philanthropy. Notice how philanthropy cannot sustain an entire population, and people are not going to like just have so much money during an economic crisis to spend on other people. But also notice how then Wesley talks about how this particular philanthropy is a short-term solution. That is exactly what our solution also is. It's not exclusive to them. Our solution is also a short-term solution that intends to like sustain the situation until we are able to come out of the crisis and we are able to solve the problem. So most of what CEO says is not exclusive, and most of what CEO says is not really like new, because we've heard a lot of that from OO already. But then notice how most of their characterization is very, very bad, and the premise on which they start their debates is the exact same premise they end up like. There's the bad premise they claim CG starts our debate on is the exact premise they end up like entering when they begin to analyze their case. CEO has probably not brought in the case in this debate so far. But then panel, what do you get from us in this debate? We show you something that is very, very important. Another response directly to CEO is how in a world where you say, oh, these international companies are also going to be affected, let's say that is true. Our world still works because these international companies could always pack their bags and go to other countries that would compromise. Notice how if Ghana, for example, decides not to compromise, Nigeria will probably compromise, which means that these companies are better suited leaving Ghana and going to Nigeria to ensure that these companies do not die and they're still able to provide these particular products and services they provide to so many people in the West African sub-region. So what do we do in our world? What we do is we ensure that productivity is very high. We ensure that the government does not waste money on bailouts and companies do not have to shut down, because most of the time, countries, and states will be unable to bail out these companies in the first place. What we do is we protect jobs, we protect the economy, and we ensure that these companies are able to go ahead and produce and sustain the economy as long as possible during the crisis period. It's been an amazing day to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Now calling upon Chief Whip to conclude this debate.
Hi, please, am I audible?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Please, my network is not really stable, so when I start breaking, can you indicate it in the text space so that I know? Yeah. Yeah, please, can I be heard?
Yes, you're right, and we'll indicate when you're breaking.
Okay, yeah, sure, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay, so Panel, I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice that there is a problem that needs to be solved in today's debate, right? And that problem is the problem of high unemployment in the economy, right? So panel, there is a need for us to know that temporary solutions are not the way to go. We need to find solutions that would actually like last long or have lasting effect on the economy, right? So panel, Wesley tells you that there is always an inflow of workers on an annual basis, right? So it means that every year the demand for jobs or like the number of people in the job market actually increases, right? So when we have a problem of high unemployment rate, and then you temporarily reduce the minimum labor standard of like people who are already working, it does not necessarily solve the problem, right? Because it means that in the next year to come, you are still going to get an increase of people demanding for jobs. So it means that the solution that government bench produces actually only solves the issue in that period of time, right? And it is not something that we want to buy into. Okay, so panel, the thing is that we need to take note of the fact that the nature of these companies and the nature in which we find like ourselves in is something that should be prioritized, right? So panel, the side that actually proves that they are able to significantly solve the problem is the side that wins today's debate, right? So panel, OG comes to basically tell us about the fact that there is a need for us like reduce this minimum labor standards so as to increase productivity by increasing the number of working hours these people have, reducing their labor wages, and then their health sorry about that. And then the health standards in these companies, right? But panel, note how this does not solve the problem, right? Because in order to solve the problem, we need to ensure that productivity is at its maximum and the economy is actually the economy is like it feels like the status in the country, right? But then is that when you actually put these individuals at a disadvantage, right? How do I say this? We say this because you realize that these individuals are expected to work longer hours for lower wages and stuff like that, which means that productivity at the end of the day would be reduced, because we need to realize the fact that individuals can only work for so much a time, and the fact that they are actually struggling with an economy that is also like crippling. That means that they also need to like take into consideration other factors and like their families and stuff like that, right? So panel, when you actually reduce this, you make it very difficult for these individuals to stay afloat or like maintain. You make it very difficult for these individuals to stay afloat and continually try to survive in an economy that is already like bad and crippling and stuff like that, right? And it is something that we want to avoid in our world. So panel, it is actually like basically like unfortunate that there are people who are unemployed in the status quo, right? But then in order to bring about a solution, we do not believe that it is principally justified to like place a burden on those who are already working just so that you can actually help those who are not working, right? Because at the end of the day, these individuals also have responsibilities and stuff that they actually need to cater for. So once you do that, you place them at a disadvantage, which
You
is
are
principally
Selasie.
on. Yeah, Elisha, let me take you.
So notice that this debate is not just about getting people employment. It is also about ensuring that people that are already employed keep their jobs because of the economic crisis and the kind of situation we find ourselves in.
Okay, yes, Elisha, I'll answer that in my subsequent matter, right? So panel, we what do we bring to you on site CO, right? We tell you basically about the fact that in such a time like this, or in times of like economic crisis or high unemployment, the people are like the companies that are mostly disadvantaged are the local companies, right? Panel,
Selasie, are you there? I've lost you. Am I the only one who has lost the speaker?
You actually, pardon?
I'd lost you. The last thing that I heard is the company that are disadvantaged are local companies.
Okay, yes. So, panel, we tell you that in this world, the companies that are disadvantaged are the local companies, right? Because of the fact that they already have to like struggle with international companies who already have a vast advantage over them and stuff like that. So when you put these companies in such in such a situation or scenario like this, you actually like place a lot of burden on them, right? And these companies are unable to actually keep up with such things, because you realize that just like the main incentive of these companies is actually provide profits, right? So it means that these international companies are going to take advantage of the situation of these local companies and then drive them out of business. And then the word that CEO actually preaches about, that they want a world where people are not sacked from their job, is actually like taken out, because you realize that once these companies crumble, people would actually like lose their jobs at the end of the day, right? And it would largely affect the local economies, because you realize that in order to revamp these economies, we actually need to ensure that the internal structures of this economy are able to hold, right? And these local companies play a role in such structures. So when you take them out, you actually like it actually becomes counterintuitive to the main model as the main reason why these things were brought about in the first place, right? Panel, note that we need to sustain the economy and ensure that like the standard of living of these individuals are also sustained, right? So panel, we tell you that we bring another alternative that does not necessarily affect these companies and then these individuals in the long run, right? And that is where Wesley tells you that, we are going to go with the alternative of philanthropy, right? Because she gave you an example, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, you realize that people donated and then like gave out charity and grants to be able to like help individuals who were largely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and such like that. So we are going to adopt a similar model to ensure that during that temporary period, there is something that is going to hold and sustain it, right? And Penny, we believe that this alternative is something that's actually better than the word that government bench preaches about, right? Because you realize that the impact it has on the economy is not something that is worth it. Because you realize that we are here to protect the individuals and then the economy, and then the companies in the long run, the economy, right? So when you do something that actually disadvantages the individuals, which actually brings about unproductivity, which in the long run would affect the productivity and then the output of these companies, which means that their profit margin is actually going to reduce. Pardon?
You're out of time.
Oh, okay, sure, thank you.
Cool. Thank you everyone for what was a wonderful debate. I'm not sure where exactly we.
Yes. Yes, Simso, who is here, is.
Opening government is in, right? Is opening government in?
One member is not here. I will be checking him right now.
Okay, please, if you can contact him.
Yeah, that would be good. Opening up.
Yeah, opening up is here.
Perfect. Closing government.
Just one person here. My partner will join us soon.
Cool. Closing opposition.
Closing opposition here.
All right. Are you also waiting for your partner, or that's it?
Give me a second to check with her.
All right, please do. I want to start OAs then.
I think if they have their teammates here, we can start and they can pass to each other.
All right, cool. So guys, this is how we're going to give feedback. I'm going to give the majority of the OA, but since this was a Spar round, I thought it's also very important for like other members of the panel to also give you insights onto like what they thought about your speeches, where you guys can also work on, and just in terms of improvement. Also, since this is again a Spar round, you're very welcome to ask for personal feedback, especially here. so that we can all learn and we can all, you know, go and do better like in upcoming tournaments. Right, so structure of this feedback, firstly, I'm going to start with the rankings, and then secondly, I'm going to talk about, um, you know, why those rankings are justified. But probably before like I give into that, like it's very also important for me to talk about what we also kind of expected in this debate. I think what we needed more, like this was a very good debate, by the way, but what we needed more was more engagements, not just on a principle level, but also on a pragmatic level. We needed to see a lot of mechanization because I thought like there were also a lot of assumptions that were thrown around and that were like not really like well explained in this debate, and that was also one of the things that affected the decision. And I also think like just also proper, you know, understanding of PP rules, such as things like how do you deal with engagement, like generally speaking, even things like how do you deal with counter propositions and all that. These are some of the things that we used to factor like into way into who got what position, right? So rankings. Um, Unanimously, we came to a decision. First goes to closing government, second goes to opening opposition, third went to opening government, and unfortunately, the fourth went to closing opposition. I'll repeat. Closing government first, opening op second, OG third, and then closing opposition fourth. Right. So let me start with closing opposition firstly. Sorry, I'm seeing someone type in the chat. All right, cool. So let me start with why we gave closing opposition, unfortunately, the fourth. And this was to do with a lot of things, really. The first thing about closing opposition's case is, like I said, another problem we had in this debate generally was like assumptions that were not really well explained. And I felt like this was something that we also got from like closing opposition. Firstly, when they talk about things such as philanthropy and they make that their case, and they talk about how this is something they ultimately want to use to sustain the economy as a whole. We needed to get a mechanization on how this is exactly going to work and how exactly philanthropy is something that is necessarily going to sustain an economy, given the very fact that this is a question that closing government asks, like, is this really something that is sustainable, right? I didn't think like we got enough mechanization here for it to be something that's done. But second problem, and again, this is something that is genuinely to do with PP debating rules. When you're giving a counter prop or a counter model, what you need to ensure is that it is a counter model that is exclusive. In other words, when closing opposition talks about philanthropy, their burden is to also prove that this isn't something that occurs in government world. But at a point where your prop or where the alternative that you are suggesting is something that also works in government world, then it is something that we are not likely to accept as a counter proposition. So since I think this is a prep for things like world's new like rules that will also be applied, they include things such as if you give a counter prop or whatever that is also going to happen in the other side of the house, then it is not something that is likely to stand, right? For instance, when you talk about things such as education, these aren't things that are in most likelihood going to stand in those debates, right? So we needed to get like more mechanization from closing opposition in terms of how exactly they're going to deal with that. So broadly speaking, these were two of the reasons why we thought that closing opposition wouldn't be able to outrank any other side in this debate. Yeah. So from here forth, I would want to analyze the rest of the teams basing on clashes and how they were able to respond to each other. So the first clash that I want to talk about is the opening half clash, opening government and opening opposition. And like I said, um, opening opposition wants clash, right? What do we get from opening government? Okay, seems like I've misplaced my papers, yeah, but I'll be speaking as I try to literally recall what has been said. So from okay, I found it. From opening government, like I think what everyone was saying is that the characterization that opening government was really good. Like they enjoyed how opening government was able to show that there is a problem that exists in status quo and how there is need for solvency in status quo. Opening government is able to do this by saying, like in most instances, we have a lot of people who find themselves unemployed. So it really affects how like the lifestyles of those people and their livelihoods, and it also necessarily affects, you know, even issues such as health and the economy at large. And these are the impacts that we get from opening government. They say, secondly, that state then has legitimacy to act because the mandate of state is to ensure that lives are protected. This is the case that we get from opening government. But again, like I think like the difference then between opening government and opening up was how OO was able to question this characterization that opening government gives, to say that in most likelihood what you're arguing for is something that is too extreme. The reason why this is so is that when you look at, in most instances, what happens in the real world is that there are certain companies that are most likely going to work anyway. So it means that there is still some level of like economic capacity that exists in those states, in as much as we can see that, you know, this is a very problematic situation, right? But I think what we also get from opening opposition, like are a lot of cases to prove why exactly like opening government world isn't really the best in terms of solving this problem. First thing that opening up gives us is like a mechanization of what exactly like is a justifiable action to take. And they say a justifiable action to take would be to put countries into like companies into categories, because like they've already said some companies are going to be okay, and it's really problematic when companies like Amazon are able to exploit people, even though, like, economically speaking, they are all right to some extent. But then, secondly, they talk about how, in instances where we categorize companies, it means issues of bailout are things that are more realistic, and these are things that we think we're able to take more action, right? But I guess what they also do is to say that in most instances, when you have employees like who are working these kinds of jobs, they are heavily disincentivized to work because the conditions are extreme. These are people who are suffering, they are sick, and it also means that in most instances, their productive output is something that is significantly reduced. So I think what OO here is able to do is to show that even in government's world, where they want to do for some, like introduce something that is extreme, this isn't something that is likely going to work anyway, because it means that in those instances, the productivity of individuals is harmed. But I think secondly, where these guys also excel at is to tell us that in that instance, there's literally going to be more exploitation of human beings. So I guess the question that I then needed to understand is, to what extent then is that exploitation like justified at a point in time where, even given the fact that people are living below like standards of living, we have been working towards getting like ideals about protection of labor and things like that. So I guess this is something that I think I needed more answer from opening government in order for them to have a way up against opening opposition. And that is why we thought like won that clash. Closing clash, I think like just generally explaining why closing opposition takes the fourth, like explains why CG is able to outrank CO, right? So I'll move on then to the short diagonal. First and second, opening government and opening opposition and closing government, and in what was like an interesting clash. So given the fact that opening government is able to point out like how this characterization ought to look like, I think the one question that I did not really have from opening government, okay, like there were a couple of things here, but I think one of the questions that I ended up having for opening government is to say, what about in instances where things are extreme? Is it justified for the rights of individuals to be put to the side in order to prioritize their lives? I think this is a clash that opening government didn't really do much to engage, and that was a question that was hanging. And I think this is something that closing government comes and then they take, like opening up, sorry. So this is something that closing government comes and then they make it their case. One of the things that closing government is able to do is to say, firstly, they question the idea of restrictions itself and what it means to lessen restrictions. And they're able to tell us that loosening restrictions does not necessarily mean that companies are able to run around and do whatever they want, but it literally means that these companies themselves can also just have like a minimum standard that has been reduced like to a bad extent, right? So it's still a standard that could necessarily be enforced even though it's relaxed, right? So it means that in as much as some of the harms that like opening opposition we're talking about how these companies are going to be so extreme that it's literally going to be slavery, there's literally going to be some level of solvency. So I think going back to the case of how opening up would have done better, I think like the kind of contextualization they should have just engaged is to say, what about even in instances where there is some kind of a net that is created and some enforceability of that net, would it still be like beneficial or harmful or acceptable really to lessen the kind of harms that would like to introduce this kind of policies, right? I think like the second thing that we get from closing government that is able to outrank where's my shit? All right, this is CG's case. So I think like what I'm also able to get from closing government that we found like had a better way up. So when opening up, sorry, also talks about things such as bailout. Given the fact that this debate is happening in like very bad conditions, I think like a lot of questions then existed for the panel, like to what extent is state going to be able to do this? And this is something that CG is able to effectively point out, right? And then what we also get from CG is to say that what now happens is that the alternative is going to be much worse because there isn't any like economic performance. Secondly, it's literally going to look like things such as high inflation. And at a point where that happens, it means that those locals which we are trying to protect anyway aren't people who are going to have like any like decent acceptable standard of living. These are people who are going to be suffering, right? And they also say, secondly, that in most instances, companies, especially local companies, are going to find it difficult to re-enter the local market because at that point in time, like they have been incapacitated. Finally, they also tell us that even big companies to some extent would have an incentive to leave if we don't introduce a policy like this, because they would obviously want to go to countries where there is better economic performance as opposed to staying in a country where things are extremely hard. These are some of the questions that we think CG is able to raise, right? And the reason why we are able to value those questions more than what we got from opening opposition is firstly, they then give us like this clash in answer to say, like, I think at this point in time, we value the protection of local lives and we value their protection because in most instances, these people are going to suffer, they're going to die. But secondly, it's literally going to transcend to economic problems that affect the country as a whole. Thirdly, it means that these companies aren't likely going to exist and perform anywhere, and fourth, they're likely to leave. And five, they're able to call out the alternatives that we get from opening opposition, which was something that I felt like was mechanized well. So there was a questioning of things such as like how companies themselves, especially local companies, are going to suffer and multinationals are going to have better leeway. I would have to say, especially to CG, that I had reservations on this clash was at a point where you are talking about these multinational companies, right? The question that I now have is, so is it still okay for you to limit the lives or to harm the lives of individuals by reducing labor standards? Um, Even though you now concede that international companies are able to offer them like better employment opportunities in our country. This was something that I think would needed to have been done well. And I think like to some extent CO analyzed that question, although the way in which closing opposition analyzed that question was also very like not properly developed. Because when closing opposition is also saying, oh, local companies sure are going to suffer, but they're going to suffer even more. Again, still the question is at a point where economic like this like international companies are able to provide this alternative, to what extent is this still something that is justified? So just to sum up, like overall, the verdict for opening government contextualization was good, but I think like to some extent it went beyond extreme and they needed to answer why even in the average case this is something that ought to happen. From closing opposition, I also get the idea of how their contextualization was good, but still the problems that I then had is what about in extreme cases? Is it still like openly justified to pursue this course of action to take? And also secondly, what about in instances where in as much as we do like create these kinds of restrictions, is it still justified? For closing government, sure, their case was able to win, but again, still I think like more mechanization could have been better, especially with how they were talking about like international actors and multinationals. Finally, for closing opposition, just the idea of like meaningfully engaging other teams and also just making sure that like their case to some extent isn't deviating from like basic BP rules and what exactly everybody has been saying. That's it for feedback. So it's time for questions and answers if there are any. Or before that, I think if there's any member of the panel who feels like they want to add more, please do so. Cool. It does seem like the panel doesn't have anything to add. So yeah, guys, any questions, any answers, like please ask.
If I may ask, how do we get personal feedback?
We can do it in here, or we can always do it